We've all met them. People completely certain of their own expertise, even when the evidence clearly shows otherwise. The coworker who confidently derails meetings with misguided advice. The relative who crowns themselves an expert after a single documentary. The online commenter who argues with seasoned professionals as if they know better. So why does this strange gap between confidence and actual competence exist? The explanation lies in a fascinating psychological phenomenon, first described more than 20 years ago. Back in 1999, psychologists David Dunning and Dunning-Kruger published a landmark study that reshaped how we think about human judgment. Their work identified a cognitive bias that now carries their names, the Dunning-Kruger effect. The effect reveals why people with the least ability often greatly overrate their skills, while those with true expertise tend to underestimate themselves. As Dunning once joked, the first rule of the Dunning-Kruger Club is you don't know you're a member of the Dunning-Kruger Club. In this discussion, we'll explore what this bias is, where it comes from, how it shows up in real life, and most importantly, how to spot and overcome it in ourselves. Because the most striking paradox of the Dunning-Kruger effect is that the people who fall into it are usually the least capable of realizing it. The story of this effect begins with a bizarre crime. In 1995, a man named MacArthur Wheeler strolled into two Pittsburgh banks in broad daylight, without any disguise, robbed them, and walked away. Later that night, police arrested him. Wheeler was stunned to hear that cameras had recorded his face. "But I wore the juice," he protested. He had smeared lemon juice on his skin, convinced it would make him invisible to surveillance cameras, reasoning from the fact that lemon juice can be used as invisible ink. This odd case grabbed the attention of psychologist David Dunning, who was struck by Wheeler's total confidence built on a completely flawed belief. It made him ask, how can someone be so lacking in ability that they can't even recognize their own incompetence? Together with graduate student Dunning-Kruger, Dunning set out to study the phenomenon more systematically. Their research, later published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, tested people on humor, grammar, and logical reasoning. Afterward, participants were asked to guess how well they had performed compared to others. The results were remarkable and consistent. Those in the bottom quartile vastly overestimated themselves, believing they had outperformed 62% of their peers, when in fact they had beaten only about 12%. At the same time, top performers regularly underestimated their standing. As Dunning explained, if you're incompetent, you can't know you're incompetent. The skills you need to produce the right answer are exactly the skills you need to recognize what a right answer is. This creates a double handicap. Not only do people lack the ability to perform well, they also lack the awareness to realize just how poor their performance is. At its heart, the Dunning-Kruger effect comes from a metacognitive blind spot, a failure to judge one's own knowledge and skills accurately. This illusion of superiority can be surprisingly resistant to evidence. The effect works through several psychological mechanisms. First is the unknown unknowns problem. When we step into an unfamiliar area, we're blind to how much we don't know. The very skills needed to give the right answer are also the ones required to recognize that an answer is right. Without those skills, you can't tell the difference, even in yourself. Second is confirmation bias. Once we've decided we're competent, we notice only what supports that belief and ignore what contradicts it. A beginner who thinks they're skilled remembers their small successes, blames failures on outside forces, and interprets unclear feedback in a flattering way. Third is the difficulty of properly calibrating self-assessment. Even when we try to be objective, people often struggle to judge themselves without solid reference points. In the absence of clear feedback or direct comparison, most of us default to rating ourselves above average, a bias psychologists call the above-average effect, or illusory superiority. As philosopher Bertrand Russell famously pointed out, the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, but wiser people so full of doubts. This observation strikes at the very heart of the Dunning-Kruger effect, At the extremes of the knowledge spectrum, confidence and competence are frequently inverted. Popular culture often presents the Dunning-Kruger effect as a simple seesaw between confidence and skill, but the reality is more nuanced. Instead of a straight line, researchers describe a distinct curve that traces the progression from beginner to expert. The journey begins on what has been dubbed Mount Stupid, a high peak of misplaced confidence reached by novices who know just enough to feel knowledgeable, but are blind to the enormous terrain they have yet to cover. Mark Twain captured this perfectly when he remarked, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." From this false summit, confidence often collapses into the valley of despair. As continued study reveals the true depth and complexity of the subject, self-assurance plummets. At this stage, many give up, unable to reconcile their former self-image with a sobering awareness of their limitations. Those who persist begin the slow ascent along the slope of enlightenment, where knowledge and confidence rise together through consistent effort and reflection. Eventually, they reach the plateau of sustainability, a balance point where genuine competence is matched by well-calibrated confidence. What makes experts fascinating is that they often display a slight underconfidence compared to their actual abilities. This comes from their deep familiarity with complexity and nuance. True experts know where the edges of their knowledge lie, and they are constantly aware of the vast unknowns that remain. Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman once put it this way, "I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers that might be wrong." That kind of intellectual humility is the true hallmark of mastery, the opposite of the inflated certainty seen in beginners. Although much of the early research on the Dunning-Kruger effect was conducted in academic contexts, the pattern extends far beyond the classroom. It permeates virtually every sphere of human activity. In the workplace, the effect often appears as the unskilled yet overconfident employee who consistently misjudges their contributions. One study found that 95% of managers rated themselves in the top half of their peer group, something statistically impossible. Such inflated self-perceptions foster resistance to constructive criticism, hinder professional growth, and create friction with colleagues. In healthcare, the stakes can be even higher. Medical students with the weakest skills frequently overrate their competence, and some doctors most confident in their diagnoses are no more accurate than their peers, but they are far less likely to double-check references or seek a second opinion. That kind of misplaced certainty can be dangerous. In politics, the effect helps explain why some of the loudest voices on complex issues, economics, climate change, foreign policy, often display the shallowest understanding. Those with surface-level knowledge may speak with unshakable conviction, while true experts, more attuned to uncertainty, acknowledge limits and gray areas. And in our digital age, the Dunning-Kruger effect has found especially fertile ground. Social media has given people with very little expertise the ability to share their opinions with vast audiences, often with the same apparent authority as recognized specialists. This broadening of voices, though valuable in many respects, has also produced what some researchers describe as an expertise crisis, a blurring of the line between the insights of novices and those of true experts. As Neil deGrasse Tyson once said, "One of the great challenges in this world is knowing enough about a subject to think you're right, but not enough about the subject to know you're wrong." That single observation captures the essence of how the Dunning-Kruger effect extends far beyond academic circles, shaping public debate and decision-making across society. The way the Dunning-Kruger effect shows up is not the same in every culture. Studies indicate that cultural norms play a powerful role in shaping how people evaluate their own abilities and how strong the effect appears in different societies. In the West, especially in the United States, self-promotion and confidence are highly prized. From an early age, children are told to believe in themselves and to aim high, which fosters fertile ground for overestimating one's skills. The American celebration of individual achievement can unintentionally amplify the effect by encouraging people to assess themselves positively regardless of their actual performance. By contrast, Many East Asian cultures stress humility, continuous self-improvement, and awareness of one's limitations. Research shows, for example, that Japanese students often rate themselves below average in various abilities, the reverse of the above-average effect common in the West. This cultural leaning toward self-criticism can act as a buffer against the Dunning-Kruger effect, pushing people toward more modest self-assessments. The difference between collectivist and individualist societies also matters. In collectivist cultures, where group harmony and interdependence are emphasized, individuals are more open to feedback and less likely to hold on to inflated self-perceptions that clash with the group's perspective. Confucius put it simply, "Real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance." Cultures that embed this way of thinking into their education and social systems naturally encourage the metacognitive awareness that weakens the Dunning-Kruger effect. Still, no society escapes the fundamental human limitation, not knowing what you don't know. That blind spot transcends cultural boundaries, even if it looks different from one place to another. While the Dunning-Kruger effect warns of the dangers of overconfidence, it's worth noting that confidence itself is not a flaw. In fact, a healthy measure of self-belief is essential for motivation, persistence, and eventual achievement. The real problem arises when confidence drifts far out of line with actual ability. Such imbalance can lead to poor choices, refusal to learn, and unnecessary conflict with others. When grounded in realistic self-assessment, however, confidence becomes an asset. Research in performance psychology repeatedly shows that optimal performance comes from a middle ground, enough confidence to take action and keep going, but not so much that it blinds you to mistakes or blocks growth. This balanced level of self-belief is often called the sweet spot, where confidence matches reality. Interestingly, some research even suggests that slight overconfidence, just a small boost, can be useful in certain situations. A mild illusion of ability can encourage persistence, help people push past early obstacles, and keep them motivated when progress is slow. The key is in the degree. Modest overconfidence can fuel effort, while extreme overestimation, the kind defined by the Dunning-Kruger effect, is harmful. Psychologist Albert Bandura described it well. People who have a sense of self-efficacy bounce back from failures. They approach things in terms of how to handle them, rather than worrying about what can go wrong. This represents healthy confidence, fundamentally different from the misplaced certainty of those trapped in the Dunning-Kruger effect. The real challenge, then, is not to get rid of confidence, but to develop it in balance with actual competence. Psychologists call this epistemic humility, pairing self-efficacy with an honest awareness of our limits. This mindset accepts both what we can do and what we cannot. Perhaps the most difficult part of the Dunning-Kruger effect is recognizing it in ourselves. By design, the bias blinds us to our own shortcomings, creating a stubborn cognitive blind spot that resists self-awareness. The first step to breaking free from this cycle is accepting that we are all vulnerable to this bias. No one, no matter their intelligence or education, is immune to overestimating their own abilities in areas where they lack true expertise. As intellectual historian Robert Burton reminded us, the feeling of knowing is not a reliable guide to whether or not you actually know something. Practical ways to counter the effect start with actively seeking feedback from others, especially from experts in the relevant field. Outside evaluation offers the objectivity that self-assessment so often lacks. But this isn't easy. It demands genuine openness to criticism and a willingness to set aside defensive reactions, at least temporarily. Another key tool is deliberate practice, focusing directly on weaknesses. But this only works when it comes with clear and immediate feedback. Without that loop of correction, practice alone can backfire, strengthening overconfidence instead of reducing it. Equally powerful is cultivating metacognitive awareness. In other words, thinking about your own thinking. Regular reflection on the limits of your knowledge, and actively considering perspectives different from your own, builds the habit of questioning your first assumptions. Socrates captured this timeless truth. The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. Perhaps the hardest, yet most effective skill, is learning to be comfortable with uncertainty. In modern life, we're often rewarded for fast answers and confident declarations, rather than careful thought and honest admissions of limitation. Resisting that pressure requires real intellectual courage, the courage to say, "I don't know," or "I'm not sure," when that's the truth. Writer and philosopher Aldous Huxley expressed it well. That men do not learn very much from the lessons of history is the most important of all the lessons that history has to teach. Likewise, the key lesson of the Dunning-Kruger effect may be to question our own certainty, especially at the moments we feel most sure of ourselves. In recent decades, our entire information ecosystem has shifted, creating new ways for the Dunning-Kruger effect to thrive. The internet has opened access to knowledge like never before. With just a few searches, anyone can gain a surface-level familiarity with almost any topic. But this easy access often produces only the illusion of understanding, fueling the very bias it seems to counteract. Social media makes things worse by rewarding bold declarations over careful analysis. Algorithms push content that drives engagement, which usually means strong, absolute claims rather than cautious, nuanced explanations. The result is an environment where the loudest and most confident voices are amplified, regardless of whether their expertise is real. Filter bubbles and echo chambers intensify the issue, surrounding people with others who share the same assumptions and reinforcing false confidence. With no exposure to contradictory perspectives, it becomes nearly impossible to recognize the limits of one's own knowledge. On top of that, the sheer flood of available information leads to what researchers call knowledge fragmentation. People collect isolated facts without the frameworks to connect them meaningfully, which creates the feeling of understanding without the substance behind it. As author Tom Nichols warns in The Death of Expertise, the internet lets us contact and interact with many more people than we would normally encounter in our daily lives. But it can also give us the false impression that our views are more widely shared and more correct than they actually are. The solution is not to reject digital information, but to approach it with stronger metacognitive awareness. That means remembering that reading an article doesn't make you an expert, recognizing the difference between having access to information and truly comprehending complex systems, and practicing digital literacy skills that separate credible sources from questionable ones. Writer Maria Popova captured this balance well. Critical thinking without hope is cynicism, but hope without critical thinking is naive. This balance is exactly what we need to navigate the complexities of knowledge in the digital age. Because while the Dunning-Kruger effect operates at the level of individuals, its cumulative impact reaches much farther, shaping societies, institutions, and public discourse in profound and lasting ways. Understanding these broader implications helps us recognize the effect not just as a psychological curiosity, but as a significant social force. In democratic systems, the effect influences electoral outcomes when voters with limited policy knowledge confidently assess complex proposals based on superficial understanding. This can lead to support for simplistic solutions to multifaceted problems and vulnerability to populist rhetoric that offers certainty in place of nuance. In organizational contexts, the effect can distort hiring and promotion decisions. Those with limited competence but high confidence may outshine more capable but modest candidates. Over time, this can lead to what researchers call confidence cascades, where entire organizational cultures begin to value and reward displays of certainty over actual performance. In scientific communication and public health, the effect creates resistance to expert guidance. Individuals with minimal subject knowledge may feel equally qualified to evaluate evidence as those with specialized training. This dynamic was particularly evident during the COVID-19 pandemic, where confident non-experts often challenged public health recommendations based on limited understanding of epidemiology. The effect also influenced educational systems, particularly when students or parents with strong opinions but limited pedagogical knowledge advocated for educational approaches that contradicted evidence-based practices. This undermines effectiveness and weakens teacher authority. Philosopher Hannah Arendt's observation becomes particularly relevant here. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exists. While less dramatic, the erosion of epistemic authority through the Dunning-Kruger effect creates similar vulnerabilities in democratic societies. Addressing these societal implications requires both individual metacognitive development and institutional reforms. Reforms that better distinguish between confidence and competence, that reward intellectual humility alongside demonstrated ability, and that create stronger systems for evaluating and communicating specialized knowledge. The journey through the Dunning-Kruger effect reveals a fundamental paradox of human knowledge. The more we learn, the more we recognize how much we don't know. As our circle of knowledge expands, so too does our perimeter of contact with the unknown. This paradox creates the counterintuitive trajectory we've explored, from the unearned confidence of novices to the calibrated uncertainty of experts. It explains why true mastery is often marked not by absolute certainty, but by comfort with complexity, nuance, and the limits of current understanding. Understanding the Dunning-Kruger effect offers us a powerful lens for self-reflection and intellectual growth. It reminds us that the path to genuine knowledge begins with recognizing our limitations and embracing the discomfort of uncertainty. It encourages us to cultivate both the confidence to act and the humility to learn. As we navigate an increasingly complex world filled with confident voices offering simplified certainties, awareness of this cognitive bias becomes ever more valuable. It helps us distinguish between hollow confidence and earned expertise, both in ourselves and in others. Perhaps most importantly, understanding the Dunning-Kruger effect inspires a more compassionate view of human error. When we recognize that overconfidence often stems not from arrogance, but from the very structure of knowledge acquisition, we can approach disagreements with greater patience and intellectual charity. In the words of physicist Richard Feynman, "I believe that a scientist looking at non-scientific problems is just as dumb as the next guy." This humility, coming from one of history's greatest scientific minds, captures the essence of what the Dunning-Kruger effect teaches us: that wisdom begins not with certainty, but with the recognition of how much we have yet to learn. By embracing this paradox, that knowledge reveals ignorance, that understanding unveils complexity. We open ourselves to deeper learning, more productive discourse, and a more accurate calibration between confidence and competence. And in doing so, we take the first step in overcoming the very bias we've been exploring.